Well, thanks so much. And it's really such a fantastic festival so far. I've really enjoyed all the speakers. And one of the things I found really interesting is through the talks from this morning, this afternoon, is the theme of justice that has been coming through. And so I want to sort of go into a little bit more detail about that through the lens of the just transition. So one of the things I think when we're thinking about well-being is that justice has a really, really important part of it, both in terms of ending the injustices that degrade human dignity, but also enabling everyone to take part fully in society and the wonders of nature. And if there's one thing I think that the brutality of the COVID pandemic has taught us, is that the importance of shared endeavour in the face of catastrophe. And the same is true for the existential threat of climate change, I think, and global heating. Long championed by the trade union movement, the just transition is now also becoming a shared endeavour. 5 years ago, the Paris Agreement recognised the imperative of the just transition, placing the interests of workers and communities centre stage so that decarbonisation brings decent work and quality jobs. Over the past few years, I've been working intensively on the just transition, both here in the UK and at an international level, focusing on the role of finance. And if you want to know more, there's an article I did on this in the January 2020 issue of Resurgence. It's really clear that the climate transition is a good news story, one that could well lead to many more jobs, vastly improved health, and remove a huge source of the corruption and conflict in the world by phasing out fossil fuels, as well as avoiding climate catastrophe. It's a real bargain. The evidence is around us. Renewable energy jobs are growing by over 500,000 a year, and every $10 million in investment, $10 million in investment creates 75 clean energy jobs, compared with just 27 jobs in fossil fuels. But we know that these benefits will not happen automatically, and we need fresh approaches that consciously steer the process of change so it brings the widest social benefits. This is the agenda of the Green New Deal, a strategy designed to confront the ecological crisis and inequality simultaneously. So the just transition is thus part of a wider struggle for climate justice. We can all remember the passionate calls for climate justice in the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations over the past year. And we know that climate change could become perhaps the world's worst source of injustice in world history in terms of the depth and the duration of the harm it will cause for many centuries to come. It will hit those hardest who contributed least to the problem. In the words of Pope Francis, we need to take urgent climate action to avoid perpetrating a brutal act of injustice, in his words, towards the poor and future generations. The climate justice agenda goes much further, looking at how the causes and the consequences of global heating and climate chaos are often refracted through the lenses of gender, of race, of colonization and class. For Mary Robinson, the godmother of climate justice, we have to create a people first platform for those on the margins suffering the worst effects of climate change. All this means that the road to a green economy must deliver positive social outcomes without leaving stranded communities behind. But sadly, for too long, the climate agenda has often been socially blind. In the USA, we've seen President Trump being able to enlist the support of coal workers fearful for their jobs. I'm sure that the great Bill McKibben, who will be speaking later, will show how we can move beyond this in the next administration. And in France, President Macron's plan to introduce a carbon tax on vehicles to drive clean technologies prompted the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest backlash, with one protester memorably saying, "You care about the end of the world, we care about the end of the month." Here in Britain, I think many of us have been inspired by the Citizens' Assembly process this year, and their report earlier in the year, a few weeks ago, made crystal clear that the solutions to climate change need to be fair. Fair to people with jobs in different sectors, fair to people with different incomes, travel preferences and housing arrangements, and fair to people who live in different parts of the UK. So the just transition is the right thing to do, but it's also essential to build the support for big changes that are needed. What I found is that workers in high carbon tech sectors tend to support green policies when they believe that credible alternatives exist. In a recent survey of oil and gas workers here in the UK in the North Sea, done by Platform and Friends of the Earth Scotland and Greenpeace, they said that they would consider moving to an alternative sector. And given the option of retraining, more than half would be interested in renewables. As one worker put it, moving into renewables is something to feel good about. So that's really good to hear about. So how do we get a just transition? And indeed, how do we get a just recovery from COVID-19? I suppose the obvious point is that you wouldn't start from here. We live in a deeply unjust world, which climate change and COVID are making even worse. But we can make progress. And I would suggest a focus on 5 things: on passion, on people, on place, on the planet, and then on really credible plans for action. First, we need passion and principle. And no one really said it better than Mahatma Gandhi in one of his last writings before he was assassinated in 1948. "I will give you a talisman," Gandhi said. "Whenever you're in doubt, or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and weakest woman or man who you have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to her or him. Will she or he get anything by it? Will it restore her or him to a control over his or her life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to what Gandhi called Swaraj, freedom for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? Then you will find your doubts and yourself melt away." I think we need to apply the same focus when it comes to climate action and the just transition. So the second P of my 5 is a focus on people. The just transition comes to life when we focus on real people, and particularly those currently excluded, whether by gender, by race, by class, or age. The starting point for the just transition is the workplace, and at its heart are questions of participation and power. I particularly like the way that Paul Novak, who is Deputy Secretary General at the Trades Union Congress, put it to me: "Workers need to be at the table. Nothing about us without us," he said. Workers have to be involved in climate decisions that will influence their lives. They need to have the skills to enable them to thrive, and they need to be confident that green jobs are good jobs. Third, the just transition will also need to be place-based. The third P is place. The just transition will also need to be driven from the bottom up by the priorities of place. This means focusing on the needs of high carbon regions so they don't suffer the Rust Belt status that deindustrialization has brought to many parts of the UK and other countries. It means focusing on social justice in rural areas as we rethink land, agriculture and food, as Tim Lang has just told us. And it means putting the just transition into practice in our high streets of our towns and cities, particularly focusing on the needs of small businesses, as we just heard from Farhana Yamin. It means making the just transition a core feature of delivering on the hundreds of climate emergency declarations across the country. And it means decentralizing our financial system, for example, through the new community municipal investments just taking off in the UK. And here we have 2 local authorities issuing new types of green savings products and bond products for local citizens to get engaged in their local climate action. And it means, I think, the just transition needs to be a question of pride and identity for local communities. In London, where I live, for example, Citizens UK is campaigning to make London the world's first just transition city. Clearly, we need to think at the local level, the community level. My 4th point is we need to think at a planetary scale. The richest 10% of the global population are responsible for over half of global emissions, with half of these people living in North America and Europe. This is where the greatest changes in consumption and investment are going to be required. But we need to match this with the focus on the needs of the South, where capacities are weakest and vulnerabilities are greatest. This means supporting efforts to realize the just transition in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia, in terms of the things we buy, how we invest, and how our governments fulfill their pledges for climate finance. And leadership is emerging. In South Africa, for example, President Ramaphosa has committed to draw up a just transition plan, which will be backed with a fund so that measures are in place for workforce reskilling, social protection, incentivizing green sectors, and diversifying out of coal-dependent regions. One of these, Mpumalanga, you have unemployment currently at 48%. So this is why the just transition is so important to move away from coal. And this points to the 5th priority. We need credible plans for a green and just recovery from COVID-19. We need to avoid what Jonathan Porritt memorably this morning called the Build Back Better bollocks, and also then design and introduce real COVID recovery plans led by public investment that accelerates investment in clean energy and nature restoration, done in a way that drives down inequality at home and abroad. In the UK, we've had a small £3 billion instalment of a green recovery plan focusing on green home retrofits, but this needs to be increased perhaps by tenfold just to meet the benchmark of other European countries such as France and Germany and the European Union as a whole. To quote the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the transformation ahead of us is unprecedented, and it will only work if it is just and if it works for all. Now's the time for the government to crowd in the trillions of capital in our savings and our pensions that are seeking a safe and sustainable home, to make sure that these investments are both zero carbon and are just. This could happen through the issuance of so-called green sovereign bonds by the government. More than this, the just transition could become an essential part of delivering a breakthrough outcome at the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow in November next year. So as the world heads towards COP26, the just transition will need to be part of every government's COVID recovery plan, every climate strategy. It needs to be part of every company's business plan and every finance strategy from banks and investors. This is not just words. Over 160 investors with 10 trillion in assets are now back the just transition and are translating this into action. So to close, we need to have the passion of Gandhi, a focus on people, be rooted in place, think like the planet, and be remorselessly practical in the real world plans to exit COVID in ways that deliver a green and just recovery. The stakes are so high. Unless we get the just transition right, we won't win the climate battle. But if we do, we will not only avoid environmental disaster, but we will find that we have delivered well-being too. Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. So many incredible things to think about there. First question from the audience is what hope do we have for a just transition from UK offshore oil and gas workers when currently hundreds of fabrication jobs in Fife are at risk of redundancy because of the casing for offshore wind turbines off the coast of Scotland are being built in Indonesia and emitting thousands of tons of carbon in shipping to support a green economy?
Well, thanks, Sarah, for the question. And obviously you're really well informed because this is a real sort of sore point at the moment. I mean, Scotland actually, within the UK, the government is actually probably trying to do more than any other part of the UK to promote a just transition. There's a Just Transition Commission bringing different stakeholders and groups together to make sure that this action is fair for all. But as you point out, there is real concern and outrage that there are workers and businesses in Scotland itself who could be making a lot of the equipment for the booming offshore industry. And unfortunately, the contracts are going elsewhere. I think this does require us to look again at our contracting policies, our procuring policies. Obviously, we don't want to develop a Little England or a Little Britain approach, but I think it does mean thinking about how we can be channeling some of these contracts so that they do benefit local economies which can generate these technologies.
Excellent. The next question is asking where you get your information from, because a member of the audience would like to know where to find the people with this mindset.
Okay, well, the work I do in my day job at the LSE, London School of Economics, is on our website, the Grantham Research website. We focus a lot on finance. Joyce, from the email, you seem to work in Netherlands. I've certainly been in touch there with FNV, who's the trade union federation there, and also the big pension funds in the Netherlands, which are some of the most advanced on this issue. One of the big pension funds, APG, has made sort of just transition a key theme for how it's going to be looking forward, both on the climate issue, but also importantly on the digital issue as well, which obviously we know is transforming the world of work as well. So actually there are some interesting examples in Netherlands. So take a look on our website and happy to tell you more.
Thank you, Nick. And what can individuals be doing to contribute towards a just transition?
Well, I think some of the things that maybe I went through at the end, clearly those of us who are in jobs, clearly we can act in our workplace to ensure that we all have the skills, are involved in the decisions about the companies or places of work we're in. So that's the first place. Secondly, I think in our communities, and I think there's one of the things that we could do as part of the climate emergency plans is essentially sort of connect the green agenda with this burning need to create jobs at the moment in the COVID crisis, but also deal with inequality. So I think making that link, often our brains are somewhat separated and we silo these two agendas, the climate and the sort of social justice. I think bring that together at a practical level in climate emergency plans. If you have savings, if you have pensions, you can make sure you can ask and demand that your pension plan is taking the just transition seriously. So not just making sure your pension plan is driving towards zero emissions, but also doing it in an inclusive way. And many pension plans have signed up to that, local authority pension plans, and so on. And in many ways, actually, I think those who have savings investments probably need to think about that as a real tool for change. One estimate suggests that shifting your portfolio to a sustainable model is 27 times more impactful from environmental point of view than a vegan diet. So it has a huge impact. So in your workplace, in your community, and then potentially through your investments as well.
That's really useful. Thank you, Nick. Can you explain how we might use green bonds to relieve debt in highly indebted countries?
Yeah, so this is actually something I work on. So one of the consequences, well, we've had a debt crisis for many decades, obviously, but one of the consequences of COVID is increasing stress in a number of developing countries. What is interesting at the moment is this is the first, I suppose, crisis where you have large amounts of the investment community, particularly pension funds, committing to action on climate change, committing to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so you have a new actor to play of actually, could we be deploying some of this capital for sustainable development, particularly in developing countries. So there are active discussions underway to see whether actually developing countries could issue sustainable development bonds, green bonds, and so on, which would be bought by investors, many investors in US or in Europe, put into pension funds. The evidence suggests they could get a sort of slightly better rate of interest, the developing countries as part of that. And also this would be a way of encouraging countries to introduce climate plans and sustainable development plans. So this is a very active discussion. For many countries, obviously, you'll also need to reduce debt and in some cases write off debt. But I think one of the things that developing countries are realizing is that actually by sort of committing to climate action, they can actually get better access to international savings and the funds held by pension funds and so on.
Thank you. The next question is, what happens if Trump stays in power for another 4 years? Will the just transition in the US have to be put on hold again?
Well, I mean, the great thing about the US is it's a federal country, and a lot of the things I find actually most inspiring are actually coming out of the state level in the US. So there's work going on in California, there's work going on in Colorado, in New York, both to drive forward in terms of the green economy, but also to make sure that this is done with a view to the interests of workers and communities. So yes, it's obviously been a disaster that Trump has been in the White House, and it's really held back climate action both in the US and internationally. But clearly, the US is a very big and diverse place. I'll sort of listen. I'll wait to listen to Bill McKibben to give us the real answer on this one. But I would think things will still continue at the state level. Companies will still be committed, investors will still be committed, and I think what the world has learned is we're going to have to solve the climate change without expecting the US to be at the table.
Great. And what about the issue of basic income in helping transition in this time when many usual jobs no longer exist, whilst we try to create new environmentally friendly jobs?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. It comes as a tool. I think there are questions obviously around basic income about where the funds come to pay for it, and you could find it a number of different sources, whether that comes from income taxes for higher income earners, whether it comes from wealth taxes, and potentially you could actually fund a basic income potentially from a carbon tax. So you're actually recycling a carbon tax, say on use of petrol or gas in your homes, and you're recycling that and giving it back to the people through a basic income. So you could do it that way. So I think it's worth considering, and I think there's now increasing demand actually today from a new report calling for a basic income. And I think connecting these two issues again is perhaps what we need to be smarter at, is connecting the social justice agenda with the citizens' income, and then that with the climate agenda, and I think bring these two things together.
Thank you, Nick. From an audience member, I tried to get my pension fund to divest from fossil fuels, but hit a brick wall. I was told that pension funds are legally required to maximise profits for their members, and divesting from fossil fuels would effectively be illegal. How does one get around this argument?
Well, I mean, sadly, you got a very Neanderthal response from your pension fund. I think the pension funds are there to serve the interests of their members, but that doesn't mean that actually you need to be continuing invested in fossil fuels. And we've seen the decline of fossil fuels in recent years. And so actually it's been a good investment to have divested. I think you're seeing more and more pension funds divesting. You're seeing more and more pension funds also committed to be net zero emissions. Some of those far out into the future, like 2050, which is great. But actually, really interesting, you got the South Yorkshire Pension Fund, which is committed to be net zero, I think, by 2030. So this is quite soon. So I think I would try again. And there are sort of materials that maybe you could look at. Divest, Invest is a platform which could help. One of the things that the LSE does is we have an initiative called the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is used by investors. And so I think divestment is now seen as a very legitimate and necessary part of the toolbox. Clearly, divestment has a couple of issues with it. One, all you're doing is selling your share in, let's say, Exxon to someone else. And is that someone else going to be a responsible investor? And secondly, it doesn't directly deal with the just transition issue. So we need to find other ways of having sort of thinking about divestment, but in ways that also do deal with the issues about the transition for communities.